Hello everyone. The United Kingdom currently finds itself in an extremely difficult position in multiple aspects, but namely the economy and public finances, which is going to be the focus of this video. So, a lot of people in the media, important commentators, etc., focuses on the what and the why. What is the situation we find ourselves in? Why it has happened? And simply put, the situation is public finances are strained, the economy is not growing, and isn't generally we have the cost of living crisis. This has happened because of successive governments' failures previously, and especially with the public finances, which is what I'm going to be focusing on now. It's an issue of the budget deficit. So, so the budget deficit right now is £100 billion. This is because the government is spending 100 billion more than it is earning back. It's more than 100 billion, but I'll just say that for simplicity's sake. So 1.2 trillion is the amount the government spends per annum, per year. The government earns back about 1.1 trillion through taxes, etc. The spending that the government does comprises of debt interest payments, paying for public services, etc. Now, there's a lot of these which are fixed. There's a lot of these which were short to medium term or maybe long term projects like HS2, where 100 billion was spent on that and it's simply gone down the drain. So we need to factor those things in. But the things the government can control are these fixed regular payments that aren't short, medium, or long term. It's almost indefinite, like infinite, because especially with the welfare state we have now, the government just can't cut state pensions, can't cut disability benefits completely or NHS completely, etc. Public services that are essential is not going to cut completely. So how, if we go into, before I go into the solution that I'm going to propose, and I'm going to give a disclaimer, obviously by no means am I an expert. I'm simply someone who's going to give a simple framework into which the policy direction of future governments can be oriented around. Just a solution, just some kind of simple framework that I believe can get us out of this mess when it comes to public finances. Before I do that, I'm going to get into what exactly government spending entails. As I said, debt interest payments, this is over £100 billion at the moment. So it's almost at the same level as the deficit. So if the government hadn't accumulated so much debt, previous governments, by running deficits, then these debt interest payments would be gone. So the government would be running a deficit, but it would be a smaller deficit. So the issue of the deficit is not just accumulating debt, and it's that it gets compounded because it's sort of an exponential thing. The higher the deficit is, the more debt there is, and as time goes on, debt interest payments will go higher, and the deficit is going to compound. It's going to have a compounding effect as a result. Just simple mathematics. So getting into a budget surplus would do the reverse effect. It would do a compounding effect to get rid of government debt, and actually it would grow the surplus over time because of less debt interest payments. I'm by no means saying we need to get into a surplus. I'm just saying we need to cut this deficit as much as possible. Previous governments have tried to do this. They tried it with austerity, which was very unpopular and unsuccessful. So I'm not going to advocate for an orthodox spending decrease. I'm also not going to advocate for an orthodox increase in taxes, because this would simply be infeasible. It would be detrimental to the taxpayer, but also the economy, which is one of the biggest issues which sort of go in tandem with the issue of public finances. Simply put, increasing income tax, which contributes to almost half of what the government income is. So it's already illogical to increase that because it's at extremely high levels already. It would slow down economic output even more, because these people who are paying high levels of income tax are the ones that are contributing to the economy the most, because they're the ones who are getting this readily coming steady income, and they're reinvesting it, spending it into consumption, investment, etc. And as you know, this is simple economics, right? Consumption, investment, government spending, these are what comprises economic output. So orthodox ways of going about, austerity, fiscal responsibility simply does not work. It's just going to put more strain on public finances or the taxpayer when there already is this situation of strain on both of them. So what am I going to propose? I'm going to propose a rethinking of the state. Simply the rethinking of public finances, public services, and tax. So it's going to be a multifaceted, two-dimensional thing in terms of the spending and the income. So firstly on spending, because this is pretty much the crux of it. Why is it the crux of it? Because I fundamentally believe that the United Kingdom has a spending problem, not an income problem. If you think about it logically, the United Kingdom has extremely high levels of tax if we compare it to our European neighbors, other developed economies that have higher quality public services, but they don't have these high levels of tax of the UK. So the United Kingdom should aim to emulate that. It should emulate that because there's really no other way of getting out of this mess rather than being innovative and thinking outside the box, thinking outside of the traditional orthodox policy methods that have been implemented and failed. And namely, we've had 80 years of the NHS. The NHS has been widely successful, but we're seeing now that the NHS has many weaknesses. And therefore, the main thing I'm advocating for in terms of the spending is to reform the NHS. I'm not arguing for a full privatization. What I'm arguing for is that large elements of it becomes privatized to those who can afford it. And this is going to link to what I'm going to say on the taxation part, because there's a lot of people advocating for so-called wealth taxes. These are going to be hard to implement on their own, because if these ultra wealthy people who aren't necessarily getting a steady income and therefore aren't paying income tax have their money in assets that aren't liquid assets, then it's going to be hard to implement. But you will have a de facto wealth tax in actuality, because what is the purpose of a tax? Is to raise government finances. Government finances are going to be net raised. There's going to be a net increase because the deficit will reduce when the government reduces spending on the NHS by increasing the private health sector, so that those who have large amounts of wealth are able, they go to the doctor through private higher quality services. And as a result, the NHS will get higher quality, because even though the government is reducing spending on it, the per capita, in terms of the people who are eligible for the other NHS services, per capita, it will remain high. What I mean by that is, simply put, without going too in depth of this new reform, because it can take hours and hours to explain the ins and outs of it, the emergency services will be available to everyone, even the ultra wealthy. But when it comes to regular doctor appointments and most NHS services nowadays that are free, other than emergency, like I said, and potentially GP appointments, those who have the ability to pay, when you consider the cost of their living, their income, and most importantly, arguably, their wealth, they will have to go through the private sector in order for these regular doctor appointments that aren't, non-emergencies, you could say, or sort of things that aren't like long-term health conditions perhaps. But that can all be decided. The most important thing is to reduce the strain of the government when it comes to paying for the NHS, such that taxpayers are able to get a higher quality NHS. Because the private NHS will be available to everyone as well. It's just pushed towards those who have a ability to pay. So that's pretty much the crux of it, and this can be applied to other public services as well, especially those that are strained, where the government simply cannot afford paying for them at this current stage in time. Cannot afford increasing investment because this would come at the cost of more tax for the taxpayer, which is, as I said before, is infeasible. So when it comes to tax, not much that can be done. Income tax, it can't be increased because it's already extremely high. Wealth tax is hard to implement, and other taxes that are already quite high can be detrimental to the economy if they're increased, like capital gains, etc. So when it comes to tax, there's not much that can be done. But the people who are advocating for a de facto, for a wealth tax, what I'm advocating for in terms of the spending reform, in terms of greater privatization, can bring in a de facto wealth tax that reduces wealth inequality and at the same time increases economic output, because those people paying for private healthcare, that's going to contribute to investment, consumption in the economy, and at the same time, people who are struggling now, they'll have a greater usage of the NHS. There'll be less people using the NHS, so the per capita investment will rise, even though the government is actually reducing overall investment. So I hope I was able to explain this succinctly, simply. It's hard to fit this in a small video. I may go into more depth in this later, but the crux of it is essentially not to look towards orthodox spending or taxation reforms, is to simply rethink the entire thing, rethink how public services are paid for, and in terms of being innovative and smart with it. If you want to impose a wealth tax, don't do it as a tax, do it de facto by sort of molding or sort of changing the inherent nature of various public services that we have, things that the government is spending for, such that it becomes a de facto thing without harming the economy, with actually helping the economy, as I said, with private healthcare being increased, but with keeping the NHS framework so that people who actually need it with health conditions and those who are extremely poor or low income generally are able to afford it with higher and better services than we have now. Thank you very much.